To scan or not to scan? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind of an asset owner to suffer the slings and arrows of incomplete asset inventories, or to take arms against a sea of OT monitoring vendors, and by opposing active scanning, end them. I believe this is a quote from William Shakespeare. If Hamlet were an asset owner who's contemplating active scanning using OT monitoring tools. But in plain English, I guess, the point I'm trying to make is, yes, asset owners understand that active detection is important, but unfortunately, they don't trust it enough to use it. And it's understandable. For instance, between 2013 and 2018, when passive detection was the method of OT monitoring, vendors were saying that the active detection of OT devices is dangerous and should be avoided. Over the years, to compensate for the limitations of the passive approach, many of those vendors slowly started to add active to their products, and the messaging started to shift. Today, these same vendors claim that the active approach is in fact safe, reliable, and highly recommended. But how can we now trust those claims, especially when there are no in-depth studies or reports to back them up? To address this gap and provide the ICS security community with a possible answer, I decided to investigate this myself. Some of the findings you may find surprising. Before we get into that, we have to cover another short history lesson, not related to Shakespeare, to clarify some key terminology. When OT monitoring vendors first decided to utilize active, they had to distinguish it from the active scanning traditionally used by IT in vulnerability scanners and other tools. So they designed their active detection to mimic the communication between engineering workstation software or diagnostic tools and OT devices. This was actually a very smart move because vendors were basically replicating well-known communications that already exist in OT networks. It also allowed them to move away from the traditional scanning of the broad range of ports and services, which, when conducted on OT devices, could have negative consequences. But in this shift, I believe vendors got a bit carried away and decided not to use the words active and scanning to describe their approach. Instead, they use many different terms, including safe queries, polling, smart polling, selective probing, safe probing, and so on. I would argue that instead of these, vendors could have simply used the term targeted active scanning, because ultimately this detection is an active communication. It is a scan, since OT devices are scanned for responses, but it's targeted to match the communication that an OT device expects from its native tool or protocol. But we get it. Product marketing teams get to dictate the terms. In this study, though, I get to call it the way I choose. So, to summarize this lesson, I differentiate between traditional active scanning, commonly used by IT tools, and targeted active scanning, which is used by OT monitoring tools. And in terms of scope, I decided to investigate both. I focused specifically on PLCs because they are the most critical OT endpoints that need to be fully inventoried, but can also be the riskiest to scan. I aimed to share my testing methodology in detail to encourage vendors to adopt similar testing procedures so they can share their results with the community as well. The other aspect I wanted to understand in this study was the difference in targeted active scanning across various OT monitoring products. In other words, can certain products be safer for PLCs compared to others? I also wanted to investigate the claim that targeted active scanning mimics diagnostic tools, specifically in terms of impact. And finally, I was curious to see the results of traditional active scanning when using this same testing methodology. So, the basis of my study was the following setup. I had a small network created using an Allen Bradley Stratix switch on which I had 3 PLCs, each from a different make and model. An Allen Bradley Compact Logix 5370, a Phoenix Contact PLC Next, and a Siemens S7-1200. The idea was each PLC would run its program while data logging was enabled through the edge gateway. Then the cyber laptop, which had high specs, would run multiple cybersecurity scanning tools, and each tool would take its turn to scan a PLC while packets are being monitored using Wireshark. Finally, the collection laptop was to view the collected data and to serve as a control. So before scanning each PLC, I would first scan the collection laptop, which also had Wireshark, to create a baseline of packets for comparison. More details regarding the setup. Each PLC was configured to have an identical running program, which was the mixing of feeds from two hypothetical tanks into a third one, based on specific constraints in the tank levels and draining rates. The scan rate of each PLC, or how frequently it cycles through its program, was set at 10 milliseconds. The two PLC parameters that I decided to investigate in this study in terms of impact were the scan time and memory utilization, both of which are recommended for monitoring or logging by the top 20 secure PLC coding practices. For the S7-1200, unfortunately, memory utilization couldn't be tracked, so only the scan time was logged on that PLC. The last point I'll mention here is that no external communications took place to and from the PLC during the test, other than with the gateway for data logging and with the NTP source for time synchronization, which in this case was the cyber laptop. Next, I'm going to talk about the measurement process that I utilized in this study. It was actually adopted and modified from another study conducted at the University of Augsburg, which mostly focused on traditional active scanning. The measurement process consisted of three parts. The first part, referred to as the pre-scan, involved the PLC running its program for a defined period of 3 minutes while data logging was enabled. The scan period was a continuation of the previous part, but the key difference here is that a tool had started to scan the PLC. This period was actually not defined and varied depending on the tool as well as its interaction with the PLC, ranging from a few milliseconds to a few minutes. Once a tool had completed its scan, the measurement process entered the post-scan period, which again was a defined period of 3 minutes where the PLC ran while data logging took place. So the pre- and post-scan periods basically acted as controls or baselines to understand the impact of the tool when it conducted its scan on the PLC. Finally, every scan by a specific tool on a PLC was conducted in triplicate, or 3 times, to ensure enough data collection and to demonstrate repeatability. In terms of the tools that I used in this study, as well as their variations, there were 9 in total. OT monitoring tools A and B are 2 vendors, which I chose to keep somewhat anonymous. Somewhat, because I'll mention that OT monitoring tool A is a vendor in the Tier 2 category of Dale's 2023 OT detection market analysis, while OT monitoring tool B is a vendor in his Tier 1 category. So the ordering is flipped. I selected both of these tools to conduct targeted active scanning, which means I would load the appropriate scanning profile before conducting a scan. The third tool on this list is Nmap, but configured to conduct targeted active scanning as well, which means I would run a script that is specific to a PLC's protocol. For the compact logics, that would be the Ethernet IP info script. For the PLC Next, that would be the Modbus Discover script. And for the S7, it would be the S7 info script. I wanted to understand how an open source tool performs compared to the 2 vendor products which I just mentioned. To investigate the impact of diagnostic tools on PLCs, I used Factory Talk Links for the compact logics, CodeSys for the PLC Next, and TIA Portal for the S7. For all 3 diagnostic tools, I basically simulated some of the day-to-day activities that an operator conducts using an engineering workstation. The last 3 tools on this list were selected to conduct traditional active scanning. IT Scanner is a popular vulnerability scanner, which I chose to keep anonymous. And for this tool, I basically ran an OS identification scan using its out-of-the-box configuration. Here, again, I wanted to understand how an open source tool performs. So I used Nmap under 2 different settings. The first was an aggressive scan using the default SYN scan method while the second was also an aggressive scan, but under the TCP connect method. So as we're getting into the results, there's one more important topic that I need to cover. Any quantitative study that is conducted without statistical analysis is typically not worth taking seriously. So for this study, it was important for me to use descriptive and inferential statistics to make meaningful conclusions about the results. Descriptive statistics, as the name points out, allows us to describe the characteristics of the data set, while inferential statistics takes us a step further. It allows us to make conclusions or infer predictions about a broader population using the data set of the study. In this table, I've listed the various tools vertically and the 3 PLCs horizontally, and what I'm showing is the type of statistical analysis that was used for each combination. For OT monitoring tools A and B, scanning the compact logics, the duration of the scan was so short that there weren't enough data points to conduct inferential statistics, but for all other experiments, both types of analysis were used. So here's an example of how I use descriptive statistics. This is for the results of code sys being used on the PLC next. On the y-axis, I've plotted one of the logged parameters, which in this case is the PLC scan time in microseconds. You'll notice that the data is categorized based on the measurement period. So the box on the far left represents the distribution of every data point that was logged during the pre-scan period. The box next to it is for the scan period, and the one on the right is for the post-scan period. This would then have to be repeated for the second logged parameter, which is memory utilization. To understand the impact of the tool on this PLC, we have to compare the characteristics of these boxes, paying special attention to the box in the middle. So we can compare the size and the position of the boxes, the position of the median represented by the middle line, the positions of the upper and lower quartiles of the distributions represented by the top and bottom lines of the boxes, the length of the whiskers, the outliers, and so on. When we do a quick visual inspection of this diagram, we can see that the characteristics of these boxes are very similar. So this diagram indicates no evidence of an impact on the scan time of the PLC. Here's another example of a box plot, but this time the results are quite different. This is for the S7-1200 when it was scanned by OT monitoring tool A. Here we can see that the middle box has experienced a major upward shift in terms of its characteristics. The median has shifted, the quartiles have shifted, the variability is smaller, and the plot as a whole does not overlap with the two other boxes. So this diagram, on the other hand, shows strong visual evidence of a negative impact on the scan time of the PLC. When the scan time increases during the scan period, or in other words, it takes the PLC a longer duration to complete a single cycle, we can say that it experienced a lag or a slowdown when it was scanned by the tool. So these two diagrams were just examples to illustrate the descriptive analysis that was conducted to get to the overview of results, which I'm going to show in a couple of slides. In terms of inferential statistics, I won't cover that in detail, but I'll mention that it was used to conduct hypothesis testing, which means I analyzed the results to determine if the observations under a specific assumption were due to random chance or were statistically significant. In this study, I used two types of hypothesis testing. The first is called the Wilcoxon rank sum test and is used to detect a shift in one sampled population compared to the other. The second test is the Brunner-Munzel test, which is typically used as an alternative to the previous one and is seen as a bit more robust. Okay, so we've arrived at the overview of results. This table here summarizes the impact of each tool on the mean scan time of the various PLCs. We're focusing only on the scan time because the experiments of this study indicated no evidence of an impact on the memory utilization of any PLC. We'll cover this table starting by each column, and we'll start with the compact logics. For this PLC, regardless of the tool used or the type of scanning conducted, there was no evidence of an impact on the scan time. For some of the experiments, such as with Nmap targeted, the diagnostic tool, and Nmap default, there was a slight shift in the scan time during the scan period, statistically speaking. But using a real-world and conservative lens, I concluded that this impact wasn't meaningful. This actually happened with the other PLCs as well under different or other tools, and I've highlighted all of those separately using an asterisk. For the PLC Next, the only tool that showed a negative impact was the Nmap targeted, which increased the mean scan time during the scan period by 5.7% compared to the pre- and post-scan periods. Obviously, this is a small jump, but it's worth considering for time-sensitive applications. The biggest surprise was with the S7-1200. Under OT monitoring tool A, the mean scan time increased by 55%. Now, this impact might have not brought down the PLC or crashed it, but it's a major concern for introducing lag or disruptions in the processes that would have been dependent on this device. The only other tool that showed a negative impact on this PLC was the IT scanner, which increased the mean scan time by 6.1%. So overall, it's probably the deviations that we're seeing here is not attributed to a single contributing factor, especially when both traditional and targeted active scanning seem to have a negative influence on some of the PLCs. In my perspective, there's at least a combination of two factors. First, the content of the packets sent by a tool, and second, how a specific PLC responds or interacts with those packets. Unfortunately, I can't dive into the results of each experiment, but I'm going to take the case of the S7-1200 under OT monitoring tool A as an example or a case study for us to analyze. Before we do that, we first have to understand how data transfer typically happens with an S7-1200 that's operating under firmware version 2.2. If we had a hypothetical HMI connecting with this PLC, the general S7 communication structure has to be followed. So a connection is first established using a three-way TCP handshake on port 102, followed by a COTP request to establish a connection on the transport or ISO layer. Once that step is completed successfully, the third step can kick in, which is to request a connection on the S7COM layer, or it could be on the S7COM plus layer. Once that step is completed, the HMI can proceed to send requests or commands for functions to the PLC using a master-slave communication model. Now, for targeted active scanning, which is using an S7COM scanning profile, the relevant request would be to read the SZL of the PLC, or the system status list, which basically contains all the system-related parameters about the PLC, including its module configuration, diagnostic configuration, and other parameters. Once all the requests have been sent and the responses have been received, then the connection can be terminated using a three-way TCP handshake. Before we look at OT monitoring tool A, let's examine the packets from OT monitoring tool B, which we know did not have an impact on this PLC. So tool B follows the first two steps of the general S7COM structure successfully. I'm not showing that here because the first packet highlighted here in green represents the third step, the request to establish a connection on the S7COM layer. This step is also completed successfully, and tool B sends its first SZL read request highlighted by the first purple packet. If we zoom in on the packet info, hopefully it's readable, you can see that this request has a unique identifier of 001C, which is a request typically used to read all the system components of a relevant S7 model. In this case, the PLC determines that this request is not applicable to it and returns an error code highlighted by the second purple packet. When this happens, tool B sends a new SCL read request with a different unique ID of 0011, which the PLC responds to successfully and is highlighted by the last purple packet. From this point, tool B will send other SDL read requests before it terminates the connection using a three-way TCP handshake. So overall, what we're seeing here is that tool B follows the general S7-COM structure or the ideal behavior very closely. When we look at the OT monitoring tool A, however, we see a different story. Similar to the previous case, the first two steps are followed successfully. Again, the first packet I'm highlighting here in green represents that third step, the request to connect on the S7-COM layer. This, again, is completed successfully, and tool A sends its first SDL read request highlighted by the first purple packet. This time, the request has a different unique ID of 0D91, which is a request typically used to read the status information of all the modules of a relevant S7 model. Similar to the previous case, the PLC determines that this request is not applicable to it and returns the exact same error code which we saw in the previous case. But it's really at this point that we start to see a major difference in this tool's behavior. Instead of sending a new SDL read request with a different unique ID, tool A sends a FINAC packet to terminate the connection with the PLC. After a few retransmissions, the PLC is overwhelmed and abruptly resets the connection as highlighted by the red packet here. When this happens, tool A repeats its entire steps from the beginning, but still ends up with the same situation. Interestingly enough, in its third attempt, tool A starts with a new SDL read request of a different unique ID and is able to follow the same steps that we saw with tool B. Now, I can't explain why this happened in the first place, and I would love to get the opinion and input from other people. But I believe that this behavior we're seeing here can explain the lag or slowdown that this PLC experienced when it was scanned by tool A. So, before we get to the recommendations of this study, based on this case study and our results, I have to make a couple of important disclaimers. First and foremost, although my messaging might have been a bit critical, I want to make it clear. I believe targeted active scanning is extremely important, and many organizations need it because passive detection alone is not enough. And the second point is, this study obviously dealt with just a tiny fraction of all the PLC models that are out there, and the testing conditions couldn't capture the complexities of a production environment. Regardless, I think there are some key takeaways here for both asset owners and OT monitoring vendors. We'll start off with the asset owners. Typically, the only type of scanning that will make sense for your OT devices is going to be targeted active scanning in terms of added visibility. If we extrapolate the results of this study, we can assume that some of your PLC models are going to experience a lag or a slowdown when scanned by some tools. Although I don't have a magic formula or a predictor that can determine the extent of it. But other PLCs might not be affected at all. To take a conservative approach, I would recommend that legacy PLCs and PLCs being used for time-sensitive applications should not be scanned during production unless they have been previously and thoroughly tested. The safe path would be to scan those devices during your downtime window. Other PLCs that don't fit in that category can and probably should be scanned at regular intervals, although I would still highly recommend to monitor their parameters and look for network abnormalities. Finally, I encourage you to work with OT monitoring vendors to validate the impact of their scanning technology on your specific PLCs, and this is something that you can do while selecting a tool, implementing a tool, or even after that. And now for our OT monitoring vendors. As we saw today, it's extremely important to have testing methodologies that validate the impact of scanning on PLCs. This is something you can implement when you're developing a new scanning profile or testing an existing profile for compatibilities. The other idea I was recently thinking about, I'm not sure if it makes sense or maybe it's already out there, but why not have some sort of a mechanism in the tool so when these error codes are received, instead of the tool continuing with the scan, it terminates it to not induce further negative impact. And I believe that sort of mechanism may have helped or would have helped the case study that we saw, as well as the other experiments that we didn't dive into. And finally, if you already have similar testing methodologies, or you plan on adopting these in the future, I would encourage you once again to please share the results with the community, because by working with each other, we can advance the adoption of this technology, but we can also provide asset owners with the data and the means to make informed decisions. So with that, thank you for your attention, and the floor is open for questions.
Great presentation, thank you. I'm just curious if you have any hypothesis on that impact scan time on the 1200, whether that was a result of an error and it took extra processing time to handle it, or if maybe that was related, like what would happen if, for example, the PLC Next had an error? Would you see a particular scan time increase? I'm just curious if any hypothesis on that.
So if I understand correctly, Sean, you're saying if the improper handling was, were you asking if it's on the PLC side or on the tool side?
On the PLC side.
Right. So from my perspective, I don't think it's from the PLC side. The error code itself was similar. Obviously, it could be when you're targeting a specific configuration or ID, it might cause other changes to the PLC, but I believe it's improper handling on the tool side itself. When it, especially since it repeated its entire steps and terminated the connection for whatever reason, that's what I would suspect.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question on the left side, on the other. Yeah. Go on.
Hey, Ralph. Thank you so much for taking the time to put all that together. A couple simple questions. How long did it take to do all the study and the research and to put all the metrics together and the data?
I started thinking about this about a year ago, putting the thought or design behind it. But the actual execution, I would say around 6 months. Yeah. So, yeah.
That seems like a lot of work. I love how you checked the 3 minutes before the scanning and then 3 minutes after. Did any of the after or any validation or checks go to functionality? I've scanned some devices in the past, and I've scanned a device, I've gotten good results back. I think everything's okay, and an hour or two later, I'll have an operator ask, hey, this device isn't responding or it's not functioning properly. It looks like it's functioning properly. When you start to interact with it, that's when you notice something isn't functioning. Was there any validation of controls or functionality, or did you see any of that in the packets afterwards?
I think that's a good question and idea. In terms of functionality itself, I didn't do any validations. I guess my indicator was looking at the scan time. I can tell you, and memory utilization, but that's not that relevant in this case based on what we saw. But I can tell you during the post-scan, there was no, statistically speaking, and even when you look at it from a real-world lens, there was no difference between the pre-scan and the post-scan. So both of those acted as baselines, and most of the validation was more from a network perspective, but it's worth looking at.
No, that sounds fair. The last question for you would be so when we scan a device with like an Nmap, for example, when we scan that, we are scanning it, we're interrogating, we're saying like, hey, is this port open? And we're expecting it to respond to us, the one asking the question, right? And we do that 65,535 times, right, over and over again. When we're scanning an OT device, or we say an OT scan with some of those vendors that you mentioned, we're not typically doing the same thing, right? We're sending like a Modbus packet that says like, what is your name, or what is your firmware? And the device is responding with that information in the wire, and then the vendor is typically listening to the wire? Is a different approach, right, to the NMAPs, to the ITs, or are they the same, or have you seen similar actions with your testing? In Synopsys, like when you scan with NMAP, we're telling the device, is the port open, and we're expecting a response to us. When we typically use like an OT vendor tool, at least in my experience, we're not asking it a question and expecting a response to us. We're asking it, hey, what's your firmware? And it publishes that, it broadcasts that information inside the packets. And then the OT vendor is sniffing or looking at that. So slightly different than what I understood would be an NMAP. Did you see similar, or was that scanning the same for you?
Between NMAP targeted and the OT monitoring vendors, the packet structures were comparable, were very similar. But yeah, with like an NMAP aggressive or the IT scanner, then those are substantially different. And even the diagnostic tools, like the interactions that I was doing, was also not really comparable in terms of what the OT monitoring tools send. But I suspect if I would capture that traffic and feed it to a tool, it would potentially provide visibility that may be similar to targeted active scanning. Not sure if that answers your question.
No, very well. Thank you so much, Raphael.
Thank you. We still have one last question that we want to ask. Go on.
Yep. Hi, Raf. Thank you for a good presentation. I like that. The question is, when you're talking about the S7-1200, and then you are type of down to the part of the low end from Siemens. Have you looked into to compare with the larger stacks and devices from Siemens, and how that will the same results you got here, and compare it with PLCs and with larger processing capacities? And yeah.
Are you asking me if I've looked at larger capacity?
Yeah, have you looked at it and also testing it? Have you?
Oh no, the scope of this study, based on like the PLCs I was able to obtain, were limited to these three. But it would be interesting to look at something like the S7-1500 and maybe see different behavior, or maybe more comparable with the compact logics, the 5370 at least. But yeah.
Okay. I'll stop there. It's all the time.
Okay.
But thank you so much.
Yep.
Talk
Thank
to you
you.
afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Raphael. Thank you.